Hi, thanks for joining us here on Royal Oak Archives. We're joined this evening by Lois Lance, a local resident and historian, to talk about the early years of Royal Oak. Lois, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Tell us about, let's begin back in the early years. Sherman Stevens, known as the father of Royal Oak. Is that where the city all began?
Well, yes, really it is. But before that, there was the division of the Northwest Territory into states and townships. And Royal Oak originally was part of Troy Township, as far as government is concerned. But I think that the territory of Royal Oak Township was always identified as that. Now, do you know what a township is? A township is 36 square miles, and it is divided into 36 sections, numbering from the upper right-hand corner, or would be the northeast corner of the township, and going across 6, down to 13, and back across for 36 townships. Almost in the very center of Royal Oak Township, Sherman Stevens decided to plat a city, and it was originally 42 square blocks from West Street to what? Troy Street, and from 11 Mile to Lincoln.
So we're talking.
And 11 Mile was always originally called First Street, you see. First, second, third.
Sure.
A lot of people now don't even know that 11 Mile is First Street.
So the city really began in the heart of downtown today.
That's right. But he didn't provide for any government. It was a little community, but it was always part of Royal Oak Township. Now, we're talking 1837. And Michigan became a state in 1839. Then in 1891, a man named Charles Allen decided that it was time that Royal Oak had its own government. Up until this time, it was governed by the Royal Oak Township. So he got out petitions, and almost by his own force, you might say, got enough signatures to have an election, and Royal Oak then became a village. Now that goes by population, and I'm not sure what the population figures on are for the division between a village and a city.
Yeah.
But by 1921, we had grown enough that we could become a city, and the vote in 1921 elected George A. Dondero, the first mayor of the city of Royal Oak.
Mm-hmm. Now, we mentioned the name Stevens, and another pioneering name in the city is the Starr family. How did they fit into the development of the city?
Well, Orson Starr was the first member of the family, and he came to Royal Oak in 1831. Royal
So he
Oak
was
Township,
actually
remember.
one of the early settlers.
But of Royal Oak Township, because he never lived in the village of Royal Oak.
Right, he was out at 13.
He was up at 13 and Main Street.
Okay.
And that's where he had the bell factory. Then his son, who came with him was 3 years old at that time. As he grew, he went into business with his father, and then he decided to branch out for himself, and around 1855-58, he bought property at the corner of 13 and Crooks.
Okay.
And the two houses that are remaining, the Orson Starr house and the Almond Starr house, it's very confusing because they have the same street number.
Oh.
3123 North Main Street, Orson Starr.
Sure.
3123 Crooks, Almond Starr.
Okay. Now, which got into the brick business?
Oh, that was Almond. And he had a very thriving business because the clay in the area was just right for making bricks. And he had what by our standards would be a very primitive kiln, but still he turned out a tremendous quantity of bricks. Then as the community was being developed and the farmers wanted to drain their land so that they could, really work it for agriculture, he went into the tile business. And that was very profitable also, drain tile.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the Stars are really my very favorite family, and the families that you might say I've studied the most. And for the past few years, I've given impersonations in some of the Royal schools, dressed up like Mrs. John Almond Starr, because she was born in Royal Township, fairly near that area, at Crookston 13. And we have quite a bit of information about her. Mm-hmm. And she and her husband died the same year, 1895.
Okay. What was the early life in the city like? Were they serving basically the rural community around them, the farmers?
Well, you say the city. The
village.
There were two centers of development. One was Chase's Corners, which is 13 and Crooks Road now. And the first post office was there. There was a general store, there was a school, there was a church. But that was not part of the early village.
Right.
It was a community, a development. The life in the village, I have never seen any actual first-person letters from the very earliest years. There are some around the Civil War, and Royal Oak community was a very thriving place at that time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. As the city began to grow, and I guess we probably began to see the most growth in the early 20th century, of course, mm-hmm. about the time that it actually became a city. Where were the city boundaries then? Were we pushing more towards 12 Mile as we go north?
Well, not quite, because my husband was born in Royal Oak in 1915, and he was born on Catalpa Drive, and he was not in the city.
Oh.
So, or in the, yes, the village. It was the village then.
Right.
So the boundaries had not been extended very far. You know, I wanted to share with you a little bit of my personal philosophy about history. I lived in Troy for 30 years and was quite a student of Troy history and wrote a little book about Troy. But my favorite expression applied to history is throw your pebble on the cairn. Now, do you know what a cairn is?
Can't tell you. I do,
well,
unfortunately.
That's a Scottish expression, and a cairn is a rounded pile or a pyramid mm-hmm. of stones. And it is a landmark, a monument to a place or an event. And the way they were formed in the early days in Scotland, everybody who went by tossed a pebble.
Okay.
And so I like to think that perhaps I've tossed a few pebbles on the cairn of Royal Oak history, and that most recently Dr. Benny has tossed pebbles on the cairn with the booklet about the cemetery. There's another fairly new publication called The Pioneer History of Michigan mm-hmm. by Barbara Bloom Shire. And each of these things adds a little bit to the knowledge.
Sure.
But nobody can say that they absolutely know what happened at a certain time if it isn't on record.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, most of us weren't there when most of these things happened, but it is enlightening to dip into them and to find out some of these things. So the city, by the 1920s, was still basically 11 Mile. Were we seeing spots filling in?
Yes, it had been enlarged by that time, but I don't have those figures in my mind exactly.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's go a little later then. After Royal Oak became a city in 1921, and I imagine the 20s and the 30s were probably, the 20s must have, of course, been a boom time for the city.
Oh, it was. One of the things that we have is the 1928 Detroit News rotogravure section, and it is a double spread showing all of the new schools and churches in Royal Oak. All of them raw land, no landscaping, no trees, but they were building schools as fast as they could. Grant School, Northwood School, Washington School. Well, Washington School was earlier. Franklin School. Those were all built in the 20s and early 30s.
Oak Ridge, which turned into Mary Lyon, in fact.
But of course, now that's another interesting thing. School districts are not the same as municipal boundaries.
Right.
And so there were many school districts in Royal Oak, and Royal Oak schools didn't get consolidated with all these outlying districts until mid-1940s, perhaps.
Oh.
And Oak Ridge was a separate school district. It wasn't part of the Royal Oak district originally.
Oh, okay. Great.
But all of these other schools that I mentioned were part of the Royal Oak district.
Sure.
And also, when that growing period was going on, the students were shunted from school to school, and nobody made any protest. They just went where they were told. They went wherever they were told. If the third grade was going to be at Northwood School this year, you went there. If it was going to be, the fourth grade was going to be at Grant School, you went there.
Uh-huh.
Because they were trying their best to accommodate the people who were moving into Royal Oak so quickly.
Sure, sure. I imagine there were quite a few as well. Well, we're talking with Lois Lance, a local historian. I'm Jeff Tunnigus, and we're on Royal Oak Archives. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Royal Oak Archives. I'm Jeff Tunnigus, and we're here this afternoon with the Lois Lance, a local historian, talking about the growth of Royal Oak. And we're up about to the 1920s. Royal Oak became a city in 1921, and we're talking about how the city began to expand and the school districts within it. What was Woodward Avenue like? It was the main artery, of course, for the Detroit area. It was still a dirt road then, wasn't it?
1920s, I think that the first pavement was put down early, right after World War I. But how far north that extended, perhaps not north of 8 Mile Road at that time. There are pictures showing the old cars on the dirt road around 13 Mile Road.
That's the one I believe I've seen.
That's the one you're thinking of.
Right.
But what the date of that picture?
Yeah. But
now you see, also the train used to go up Woodward Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And when I grew up in Northwood School, I mean in Northwood subdivision, I went to Northwood School. When I grew up, the train was going up Woodward Avenue, and from my bedroom window, my sister and I used to count the freight cars, because you'd see the light shining from 12 Mile Road traffic through the freight car divisions, and that was our going to sleep fun.
You mentioned the streetcars. I recall from my youth in downtown Royal Oak, and the streetcars were long gone by then, but I recall the ridges in the streets. I recall going across right at 11 Mile and Main Street before they repaved the roads several years ago, you could follow the tracks, and they went right down 4th Street and onto Washington.
Well, the streetcar was a great thing, and I think that's a great lack in our area right now, that there is such a little bit of public transportation.
Yeah. Now, did that link into the main line on Woodward Avenue, or was that just a local line that we had in Royal Oak?
You're talking about the streetcar?
Yeah, the streetcar.
Oh no, that
right
went right down to the foot of Woodward Avenue.
Okay.
I rode that many years, many times. And of course now we don't have the commuter trains either. When I worked in Detroit, we always took the train down to work.
Right. Well, in fact, I believe we're supposed to be getting a new stop in Royal Oak at...
Well, I hope that really materializes. I'm sort of looking forward to that, to having the train stop in Royal Oak again and be able to go someplace. You know, we were talking about the early names in Royal Oak, and this is a copy of an 1856 map of Royal Oak Township. And the thing that's most interesting about it is that it has the larger farms and pieces of land identified by the owner's name. Now here's David Williams, and
named the William Street?
William Street. Azure Parker, that's where the present Northwood Shopping Center is.
Parker School.
We have John Benjamin, and there's a Benjamin Street.
Right.
We have Orson Starr, and not Amon Starr, because you see he wasn't a landowner in 1856. But Orson Starr has large properties of land. And these maps are so interesting and valuable for anybody who is researching either property or ancestry.
Right. Back in the early days, who was the largest landowner in the area?
I don't think there was any real one. Now, according to this one, David Williams was one of the biggest, and that was at Rochester Road and 13 Mile area.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were growing up in the Northwood area, that of course was probably about wartime.
Oh, thank you. Before that.
Okay. But we must have been seeing the city not only moving north, but also west and east.
Yes. Yes, they were annexing land over to Stevenson Highway. And then, of course, the area that is now called Beverly Hills area, which was west of Woodward. And I think that was quite late for annexation, maybe as late as 1940.
What was most of that land? Was it inhabited? Was it farms?
Yes, but not actively farmed when it was annexed. It was already subdivided.
Okay. As we push north, say up Rochester Road, to the site now that's Red Run and the park there, when was the river actually ran through up Vincetta, didn't it, and across the park?
Yes, and Red Run is the official name of the stream. The run is a body of moving water. It is not Red Run Creek, it's Red Run. And it followed what is now Vincetta Boulevard, as you say, and I remember very well the little bridges that are still now the cement bridges, but I remember the wooden bridges that were over Red Run on Vincetta Boulevard.
When did they begin to, when did they pipe it up and put it underground? Do you recall?
No, I don't. I probably stood and watched it, but I don't remember when.
You mentioned the school district earlier, and how there were many different fragments that that all came together eventually. What was the determining factor to consolidate?
Oh, I think just the general feeling that was prevalent in other parts of the state also, that you could have a better school system if you cooperated. Now, there are still people who say that you can get a very good education in a one-room school. I've never had the experience of either learning or teaching in a one-room school. And I think that you can get a good education, but I think that our school system is really so important that they were thinking that it would be better for the students.
Sure. You mentioned that you went to Northwoods School. From there, for high school, you must have gone to...
I went to junior high, which was the original Royal Oak High School.
Which became Clara Barton.
Which became Clara Barton. And then to Royal Oak High School, which is now Down Darrow.
Yeah. Let's point out for our listeners and viewers out there who in case don't know, Jim Frazard, Pontiac and Buick, walk right past their brand new showroom, and that is the school to which we're referring here.
The site of the school.
Right, the site.
The school is not there.
Many schools that aren't
I have a few bricks from it.
Oh, do you?
I don't know what I'm ever going to do with them.
Oh, they're a nice souvenir. What was the high school like at the time? It must have been a small class?
Well, my class was under 100, but you see, we had 2 classes a year, a January class and a spring class. So altogether, each class was over 200. Actually, the population of the students, or the student population, was larger than it is right now.
Really?
Yes. And we had more activities, I think, in the school. Mr. Tenhave was the biology teacher, and he had a wonderful botany and biology club. We had what we called the Girls Lit Club. Basically, we were the pages in the library, but we got together and had book reviews, even in high school. There were many other clubs, and we had the Washington Club. Everybody had to sell Jell-O. And what else did we sell? Some kind of soap, I think, to earn credits for our trip to Washington, and that was great fun. And many of the classes, I think that it was probably over a period of 20 years that the classes went to Washington for their spring trip. And Catherine Gunn, who later became Mrs. George Dyer, and George Dyer were our class advisors and chaperones. And they had to stop at about 1945, partly because the students were getting a little bit more out of hand on the trips. And I think there were some other transportation problems involved too.
You mentioned 1945, the year that our soldiers returned back to town, and that also must have been a very big year for the city, for the returning servicemen coming home and starting families.
Well, I don't have much recollection of that from a first-hand basis. I was busy with my young sons at that time. But I have 11 scrapbooks that were started in 1935 by a member of my class. She never married, and she kept scrapbooks until 1962, and they are filled with the pictures of the soldiers in uniform while they were in service, and then as they came back and of course, sadly, also many notices of deaths and wounding. But those are a very interesting part of Royal Oak history, and I don't know what's going to happen to them eventually. I have them in my possession now, but they'll go in the archives someplace.
Yeah. So we must have seen the west of Woodward, the Beverly Hills area must have begun to build up then, and the old Oak Ridge area began to build as well.
Beverly Hills is unique because there's no business. On Woodward Avenue there is,
right.
But in the rest of it is all very fine residential area.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad that Royal Oak was able to keep it that way. I think that some of our residential places have been a little bit spoiled by this spot business.
Yeah. There used to be a small community up at 13 in Rochester, if I recall. When I was very young, there was the post office up there. There were a couple shops. There was Sherman Drugs, and it was probably something long before that.
Well, at Oak Ridge, you're talking
right.
about, yes.
Right.
Well, it was always a branch of the Royal Oak Post Office. It
right.
wasn't a separate post office.
Right.
And I don't know that there was ever a major church in the early days in the Oak Ridge area.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there was the church at Chasen's Corners, and then Almond Star not built, but provided the bricks, he and his son Edwin, for the First Methodist Church of Royal Oak. The Methodists and the Baptists, you know, have a good-natured fight about who came first, because I think that they actually had their first organization meeting maybe 2 months before the Baptists.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Baptists, however, beat them to the draw by putting up the first church building in Royal Oak.
Right, right.
And so we've had many cooperative get-togethers and joking about who came first.
Yeah. I'm sure there's a lot of great stories to tell about those, the founding churches in the city as well. But unfortunately, we're running out of time, and we'll have to delve into those another time. We've been speaking this afternoon with Lois Lance, a local resident and historian, about the history of the early days of Royal Oak. I'm Jeff Tonnegas, and join us again on another time for Royal Oak Archives.